Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, What Happens When You Criminalise Coercive Control. This webinar has been an incredibly popular webinar. We've had lots of registrations, and so it sounds like there's a lot of interest in the room to hear from the experts that we have in the room today. I'm your host, Teresa. I'm Teresa Kellett from WorkUP Queensland, and I would like to begin by acknowledging that I come to you today from the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'd like to pay my respects to the custodians of this land, to their elders, past and present, and I also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our audience today. I encourage you to all to make your own acknowledgements via the chat and share the lands that you are coming from. As you all know, Queensland has just changed how the law sees and responds to coercive control. But what does this mean for our practice? What's going to change? How might it affect the work that we do and the people that we support? WorkUP Queensland has developed a raft of responses to help the sector. We have curated a page of resources and information on our website. We're offering training opportunities that you can access via our What's On page. And coming up in 2 weeks is a roundtable event developed in response to sector feedback, at which we will learn from each other and workshop new ways of working in this landscape. There'll be more about that at the end of this webinar. To help us, we can learn from others who have gone before us. The UK has had similar laws for 10 years, and New South Wales put their laws in place last year. Today we get to hear from experts about what they've seen. Joining us on the live stream today, we have the Executive Director for the New South Wales Bureau of Crime, Statistics and Research, Jackie Fitzgerald. Give us a wave, Jackie. We have Hayley Dean, Solicitor Advocate for Legal Aid New South Wales. Give us a wave, Hayley. And later on, we'll be joined by Dr. Sinead Berry, who is the Strategic Policy and Project Manager for Coercive Control at the DFE Command in New South Wales Police, which is quite a mouthful. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We are going to start, though, with a conversation that I had a couple of weeks ago with Professor Sandra Walklate. Sandra currently holds the Eleanor Rathbone Chair of Sociology at the University of Liverpool and holds an adjunct professorial role at QUT. She's been working in and around issues of criminal victimisation and its impact since the early 1980s. And amidst her many achievements, she's been actively involved in training police officers. With her colleague Charlotte Barlow, Sandra recently published a paper that brings together 3 research studies from the last 10 years in England and Wales. And it offers lessons for places like Queensland, who we're just starting this journey. That paper was the focus of our conversation. We'll play that video for you now, and then we'll return to talk to our New South Wales colleagues about their experiences. Hi, Sandra. Thank you so much for taking the time to have a conversation with me today.
It's wonderful to talk to you, and especially to be reaching out to colleagues of all descriptions in Australia.
I'm sure they'll be very enthused to hear what you've got to say. So we're here to talk today about the criminalisation of coercive control in the UK and the experiences that you've had and that you've observed in the work that you've done. So let's just dive into the conversation.
Okay, great.
So can you briefly explain for the people listening how coercive control law is actually constructed in England and Wales?
Yeah, that's interesting, because there are some differences between the way in which that legislation has evolved over the 10 years it's been in place and the directions in which the jurisdictions in Australia are going. I think the key issues I would draw attention to are in the 2021 Domestic Abuse Act, in which that offers a statutory kind of framework for responding to coercive control. One of the continuities with the 2015 legislation is that it's not presented as a gendered offence. Now, that's really, really important, because the Scottish legislation, considered the gold standard, does embrace gender as a key feature of this kind of problematic behaviour, but the English and Welsh legislation doesn't do that. And in fact, in the 2021 legislation, it extends the potential for coercive control behaviour to exist between any family member. And that's people personally known to each other. So that can be people in a relationship, in a former relationship, but of course other family members too. Now that's quite a broad definition. I'm not being critical in saying that, because there's increasing evidence around the problematic nature of adult children caring for older parents and so on, and some of the dynamics around that being very similar into the context of coercive control, but it does continue that degendered approach. I think the other thing to bear in mind about the 2021 definition is that it's concerned with a course of conduct, so it has to be repeated or continuous. So it's that raises obviously questions of evidence and where you draw the evidence from. And the defendant must have known, or ought to have known, that their behaviour would have a serious effect on the victim. And that serious effect can range from fear to distress. So it's kind of quite, again, a broad-ranging definition. And I'm drawing that out because what I've picked up is that in Queensland, they've used intent. And intent is a much stronger concept to me than having known that this might have a serious effect. So one of the things that's really interesting in the way in which legislation around this issue has evolved is the different nuances of how the different legislative frameworks take on board how to problematize this, and then sets the scene for what is actionable or not actionable. So, I mean, so that's that, in a sense, that's a big caveat. That's a big cautious, observation about when you look into other jurisdictions, you've really got to understand some of those nuanced differences, I think, in terms of what you can take from there and transfer it to here, as it were.
Yeah, that's very true. It sounds like there are some similarities, but there are some significant differences between the two jurisdictions. So it's really good for us to start the conversation with that sort of shared understanding. And I think some of the similarities there around what constitutes evidence is certainly some of the same concerns that we've been hearing from practitioners in Queensland about what it will take to evidence a charge of coercive control.
Yeah.
So,
and what struck me was that use of the word intent in the Queensland legislation, and that isn't there in the English and Welsh legislation, and I don't think it's there quite the same, and doesn't use that word in the Scottish legislation either. So it's kind of making things difficult before you even start. Sorry, that was a very personal observation, but it kind of making things tricky before you even start the road, if you like.
Yeah, and I guess you can look at that two ways, can't you? Like it's a barrier, it creates a barrier in some cases, but then I guess when you get to the conviction stage, that conviction might be more secure because of the work that you've had to do to get there.
Yes, yeah. That's a very good comment. Yes, obviously that's true too. Yeah.
So yes, still evolving.
Yeah.
So we've had a very live debate in Australia around the merits of criminalising coercive control. There's been some very strong advocates for the pathway of criminalisation. There's also been some very strong advocates for non-criminalisation. What was it like in the UK?
I don't recall us having that kind of very vocal debate. I mean, I was in Australia when some of these debates were happening, so I'm very sensitive to the specific cases that informed the debate, and as well as specific TV programs and so on, and particular books, and there's no sense to me that was the same in the UK. You can reach back to 2013, where you look at the Home Office definition of domestic abuse, and you can see the beginnings of coercive control infiltrating those levels of understanding. So I would say it's been was Stark's work, I think, has been influential in changing academic politicians' framing of how we understand what goes on between two people. It's been much more incremental in the UK, because I can go back to Home Office Circular 60, 1990. Yes, okay, that explains the white hair, which was the first circular that said to police forces, you must treat violence in the home as seriously as you would violence in the street. And from that point, through the 90s, we had dedicated domestic violence units where you had a team of police officers whose specific brief was to deal with all domestic abuse incidents that came through to them, and to help people, support people, put them in touch with support agencies and so on. I think they got quite expensive to run, actually, as you got through to the late 1990s, and then it became a generalist policing function. So there was lots of training going on for people in that kind of field. And then you get the 2004 Victims and Domestic Abuse Act that extended some of our understanding of domestic violence, introduced multi-agency conferencing and so on. So you can see there's a kind of gradual story going on there, by which time, you've got, I say, the broader understandings embracing the concept of coercive control in a way that they hadn't done before. And I'm very careful about that, because coercive control didn't start with Stark. It's been around in the literature since the early 1980s, but it is interesting how a particular idea gains momentum at particular points in time.
Well, I was very excited to read the paper that you and your colleagues wrote, where you reviewed a whole lot of different interventions by police forces over the last 10 years. So I'm really excited to have the chance to actually unpack that paper a little bit with you today, and we'll obviously put a image of the paper and how to find it on the screen so that people watching can read it for themselves. And so you looked at 3 different studies and examined what they told you about the implementation of the law over time. In that review, you did find that the use of the offence was low, especially when you consider that in the context of all domestic violence cases. And there was a suggestion in there that police officers might even be scared to use the offence. So can you tell us what you've learned about police officers' understandings and how this has influenced the use of the offence?
If they were afraid, it was because they knew how hard it was going to be. But certainly over the 10 years, the stats in general show us that there are more cases of coercive control being recorded and going through the criminal justice system, and people are being sentenced for that kind of behaviour. But it's minuscule. It's minuscule in comparison to the number of domestic abuse cases as a whole. But in the forces that we worked with, that change, that gradual increase of using the offence is evident. So it takes time. That's the key message. 10 years and you start here and you're gradually getting there. And so in that, police officers have come to learn, I think, what the demands are of responding to incidents of this kind. And I would say, first of all, I think it's important to remember that very few incidents that police officers go to come to them as incidents of coercive control. The call centre will send them out to an incident of domestic abuse, more than likely. Yeah, they won't. Look, women don't call in to a call and say, I'm suffering from coercive control. Actually, few women call in to the police at all. And that's really important to remember. So that's the first thing to remember. When a police officer turns up to an incident of that kind, they're not necessarily have been told this is a case of coercive control. So early on in the first study that we did, police officers are very much still of the frame of mind that if there was physical evidence, they could action that, you know, because they knew what to do with that, and didn't necessarily feel obliged to ask a few more questions about what was going on here. In the last study that we did, which was in 2023, so we're quite a few years on from the first fence, of the 13 police officers we interviewed, all of them talked about digging deeper. All of them talked about the need to, if the two people were still in the same house, separating the parties, talking to them separately, asking questions about, does he let you see your friends? Does he let you see your family? And so on and so forth. You know, has he got a tracker on your mobile phone? In other words, they'd learned through that time of the importance to just take a little bit of time to listen a bit more carefully, or to ask a few more questions about what might be going on here. Over the 10-year period, what many police forces have learned, that unless you've got a good evidentiary file, the Crown Prosecution Service are going to send it back to you anyway. So there's more stuff in there about whole system learning. Yeah. But I would say that it's important to remember that that first point of contact between a frontline officer and in relation to an incident involving abuse is actually quite a tricky one. Yeah. I still think in our last study, the police office found the easiest ones to deal with where there was drugs, alcohol, and mental health problems. Yeah, because they fit into the kind of classic, what the psychologists call the toxic trio. Yeah, they kind of know what to do with them. We collectively, criminologists, academics, those in the domestic abuse field that I work with, focus an awful lot of attention on that frontline moment. But of course, what we really need to understand is that that's a process too. You know, so you may get a police officer who's done their hardest to get an evidential file together, and it gets knocked back by the Crown Prosecution Service. Or, you know, and it would be foolish not to admit that this happens, is that you know, if criminal proceedings have taken place and the woman was very uncertain about doing that, she might retract, she might pull back. And that's another moment at which there are opportunities for, using your term, figures in authority to do something better, to actually, you know, go, okay, let's put her in touch with support agencies then. Let's do something proactive. And again, from the last study that we did a case file analysis of a random sample of cases that had featured coercive control, and we compared a sample of cases in which arrest had occurred and arrest hadn't occurred. But a commonality across all those cases was that something proactive had been done. So they'd either been put in touch with an independent domestic violence advisor, they'd been in touch with the health services, they'd been offered some other form of support, even where arrest hadn't occurred. And that too is a change. So that again, for me, points to the whole system approach.
So let's look at victim survivors in a bit more detail. Okay. So you did discover in the context of your review that for some victim survivors, they were disappointed, they were frustrated with the progress of their cases through the courts and the communication that they'd had with the police. So what can you tell us about what you discovered about victim survivors' experiences?
I think there were a number of continuities and a number of discontinuities. So in some respects, despite this legislation having been here for 10 years, victim survivors were still reluctant to report. Many of the cases that come through have not been reported by victim survivors themselves. They had difficulties in even identifying coercive controlling behaviour for themselves, let alone talking about it to anybody else. Yeah. They were clearly still articulating concerns about communication with police forces. I think I've said that already. In the same way that victims generally actually have problems with communication with police forces. It's the key problem that most victims of crime say, but they never told us what was happening. And that's exactly the same for victim survivors. The power of ideal victimhood still pertains, you know. So if you're I'm probably going to offend people now, but if you're a kind of white, relatively well-off, articulate woman, you're going to be listened to much more readily than if you're not. I'll just leave it at that. So notions of so, you know, a rampaging woman who's kind of got a fits of flailing because she's so angry is not going to get very good response out of the police. And the lack of the police response to actually understand their experiences in their terms. Two key differences, though, over the 10-year period. Increasing expectations on the part of victim survivors for the police officers to put the puzzle together. Yeah, they were, and I think that's a reflection of the wider public awareness of the problem of coercive control, you know, that knowing, perhaps not being able to articulate very well, but knowing this has been going on for a long time and you're here to do something about it. So put the bits of the puzzle together, you know, I'm telling you this happened then and this happened then, you know, so the greater expectation on them, on expecting police officers to be able to do that. And also a greater expectation on the part of victim survivors to be listened to.
We also talked a little bit earlier about the challenges around what constitutes evidence.
Yeah.
So that's been a really key topic here in Queensland and Australia more broadly, and certainly something that we've been hearing at WorkUP directly from practitioners about the concerns that they have about what this means for their roles. I thought that the challenge was really neatly summarised in a quote from your paper from one of your study participants who was a victim survivor themselves.
Yeah.
And they said, it's easy to rebut. So if you accuse someone of putting a tracker on a vehicle, for example, all I have to say is, I was concerned for her safety. If it was financial, I have control of their money because they are no good with money. I have her best interests at heart. And how do we prove otherwise? We don't know their intention. With an assault, it's easy to evidence. But how do you evidence what's going on inside someone's head? Thinking about this and thinking about how to respond to these challenges, some people might suggest that what's needed is more police training. Do you think police training is the answer to the problem of evidence and evidence collection?
So I would say, yes, please, the police can be encouraged to ask more questions. I think it's really important not to just train police officers. This is my very personal view, in a vacuum. You've got to do that with prosecutors, with other people in the criminal justice system, get them all in the same room, you know, with victim survivors, so that you can understand what some of these dynamics look like. I also think it's important to education initiatives. I mean, you know, if you have to start with some of this in terms of relationship education, you know, so you can get teenagers to talk about, well, is it okay to text somebody every 4 or 5 times a day to see what they're doing and how they're doing it. I mean, and that kind of stalking stuff, isn't that new? You know, because people used to do that with landlines and stuff. But it's kind of encouraging younger boys and girls to be clear enough about what their boundaries look like, and to be able to talk about those boundaries without being without it conveying a message that I don't like you or whatever, but it's having that level of confidence. So I think it's actually quite a mixed picture. If you really want this way of responding to relationships to make a difference. So it's yes, you can get police officers to ask more questions. If you want that to make a difference in terms of criminalisation as a whole, they can't do that on their own. It's got to be with the support services, with victim survivor voices, with prosecutors, with judges and so on. You've got to have those combined. You've got to have them all in the room so they all know what they're doing and why they're doing it. If you want to change the bigger picture, you get into relationship education.
So if we were look to step out a bit and look at what you learnt from reviewing the studies as a whole and think about them in a Queensland context, what might you expect our practitioners to see and experience in the short and medium term? Now, I'm not expecting you to put your crystal ball on and give us a prediction of the future, but what sort of things might you suggest they might see along the way, things that might come up?
I think there will be rising expectations from victim survivors in particular, and people more generally in the community who are people who report these kinds of incidents. So there will be a rise in offences. There's inevitably going to be a rise in offences. Slightly longer than that, that will demand resources, because these offences take time. You don't just go out and give them a ticket and come back. They take time. You have to spend time with people. That demands resources. So there will be resource increases. I would also expect to see, and I'm not just talking about criminal justice system here, I would expect to see increased demands on the voluntary sector too, in terms of people wanting to make sense of, does my life fit into this category? Especially if they're unhappy with it, and what can I do about it? So there'll be, I think, more calls to support services. And I think they will probably find that in the short term, they'll have one or two tricky cases to deal with, which will be the test cases, The important thing is that it's not a quick fix. No, it's not. I'm of the view that yes, the law can send out a symbolic message about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. If you want things to change in the wider community, it takes a lot more than that. It takes a lot more than the law to do that. So there's a lot of public learning to go on, and in a context at which, if you look at wider public surveys, the general public, and I think there was one done in Australia fairly recently, that kind of pointed to the fact that out in the general public, people still didn't think women were to be believed.
You're not expecting a flood of cases to hit the courts any moment soon, like in the next few months. There's not going to be a cascade of cases that people.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that's going to happen. But there will be people, I guess, wanting to know, and as there's a wider public awareness of these changes. Obviously, in the light of a particularly horrendous case in Queensland a number of years ago. I mean, and these things do act as catalysts for change. People will want to know, but it'll be a long process. And if you're going to do it properly, it requires resources.
Well, Professor Walklate, I cannot thank you enough. This has been a fascinating conversation. At many points during the conversation, I've had to stop myself from wanting to go off into all sorts of tangents and say, oh, this is my experience and that's my experience. But I think what you've shared with us is really helpful. I think it will really help set us up for a good conversation in the Queensland context. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what else comes out from yourself and your colleagues and the papers that you're authoring. Thank you very much for your time today.
No problem.
And as I said at the end there, I could have spoken to Sandra for a lot longer. We actually spoke for about an hour, and it's a condensed version of the conversation. She has advised that she'd be happy to be contacted if anyone in the audience has any further questions, and we're going to pop her email address in the chat for you if that's something you're interested in doing. But now we have the great pleasure of turning to our panel, our local Australian experts, our colleagues in New South Wales who've had the experience of the law being placed for the last 12 months. There are some similarities between our two jurisdictions. So both sets of laws have some foundational similar goals, and they differ in key ways. So they've both made coercive control a crime, and they've recognised it as a pattern of behaviour that is intended to dominate or control another person, and both focus on patterns of behaviour rather than isolated incidents. In Queensland, the law encompasses past and present intimate partner relationships, family relationships, and informal care relationships. In New South Wales, only intimate partner relationships are currently covered by this law, although I understand that there are intentions to review the implementation and consider whether that should be expanded. The penalties are also significantly different. So in New South Wales, the maximum penalty is 7 years, and in Queensland it's 14. And of course, we only started with our law earlier this year, whereas in New South Wales, it came into effect last year. So now we get to talk about what happened when it did. So, Jackie, many people here in Queensland might not know what BOCSAR is. Can you quickly explain what your organisation does?
Sure, Teresa, and let me know if I have any issues with my tech, won't you? I'm from the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. So we're a research and analytics agency within the New South Wales government, and we focus on trends and patterns in criminal justice and crime issues. So we work across all offences and the court system and the custody system, really looking to try to inform policymakers and government about how to improve safety, improve the efficiency of the system, and make informed policy decisions. So yeah, we've been around a while and we do work with colleagues in other states, but we sit on a whole raft of data and are very proactive in sharing that. So we have a pretty open data policy and really support people getting access to what's happening so they can both be informed and make sensible decisions about how to improve the situation.
Thanks, Jackie, and welcome to the conversation. Hayley, you support people going through the justice system and you have strong interest in this law in particular. You've even been part of a podcast that has looked at the issue in more detail. What draws you to this work?
Hi, Teresa, and thank you everyone for joining today. I've been really happy to hear from Sandra and Jackie, especially from the UK insights. About 18 months ago, I was able to take on a role that allowed me to explore some interest areas that had been burning away for a very long time. I've been a prosecutor, I've been a defence solicitor for nearly 20 years. And I'd started to reach that point in my career where I wasn't necessarily aligned to a side anymore. I'm more interested in rights and wrongs and understanding the why behind them. So about 18 months ago, over a Christmas holiday period, I went into the wormhole that was coercive control. And I read Stark's book. I started working with him online. And I wrote a paper about coercive control just in time before the laws came out. And that paper then was used by a lot of professionals in New South Wales as a buttress into understanding how these laws were going to actually function in the work that the legal actors in the court system do. And I haven't really stopped looking at the issue since then. It's been a hot piece of lava in my pocket that I walk around with every day. And domestic violence is the most common offence in New South Wales, prosecuted in New South Wales courts. It's great to hear from Jackie because I draw on her data all the time. But in the calendar year ending June last year, there were over nearly 36,500 singular prosecutions in domestic violence that were finalised in New South Wales just last year. Now, they can have more than one charge. So for lawyers and for the system of those who work in the justice system, this is the everyday of working in courts. So I really find understanding it important. But more important for me on a personal level, I wanted to understand why it's happening for our communities, in our society. Why is this such a scourge? So I've gone in search for those answers, and I'm still curious, still wanting to continue the search now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Haley. I think that's it's going to resonate a lot with a lot of the people in the room today. I mean, certainly your observations on the prevalence, the high numbers, the importance of the issue, and the links to justice and well-being. Jackie, let's turn back to you. So I understand that BOCSAR has been collecting data over the last year, and I have seen some of the data that you've published, and you may have recently published or maybe about to publish some new data. What have you been tracking, and what have you learned?
We have, Teresa. So we've been publishing quarterly monitoring reports on the reform and how it's tracking. And I have actually pulled some data from our most recent report for the group. So are you okay if I just share that now?
I'd love you to share that now. That'd be great.
Okay, let's do that. So the law came into force the middle of last year. In the first 9 months, we've had 224 incidents recorded by New South Wales Police. This is what they look like over the pattern of those months. So we did get a good number in that first month, 22. I actually expected the number to increase over time, but it hasn't really done that. It's been reasonably stable across the months. So as you've discussed, we do require a pattern of behaviour, but all behaviours have to have occurred since the legislation commenced. So they can't be prior to July 2024. And I guess we suspected that as the amount of time expanded, that you could draw on those behaviours, we'd get more incidents each month, but we haven't seen that so much. So it's been reasonably steady. But probably slightly higher than we had expected prior to the reforms. In New South Wales, the legislation lists a number of controlling behaviours that are examples of coercive control, and we are able to see which of those are the most common. So on average, there's about 3.5 coercive control behaviours recorded on each incident. And this is what they look like. So from most common to least common, we've got these harassment, monitoring or tracking, and threats and intimidation being the most common. Also, financial abuse has proven to be very common. So about half the incidents are recording financial abuse. And you can see that these particular measures are less common. Some of the phrasing of these, like lumping together tracking with harassment, is not ideal. That's something that we've inherited from the legislation, unfortunately. There's another one in here, which is social isolation and cultural abuse. Pretty different behaviours there, but they are in the same category. So that's not ideal. But notwithstanding those limitations, it does give us a sense of what's being captured in the coercive control legislation. We do have, I think I've said that there's a person who has 10 controlling behaviours listed on that incident. I think it was about 43, so about 20% have a single incident, a single behaviour recorded. So it's, multiple behaviours is the most common. What we're finding is that probably as expected, coercive control is being recorded with other domestic violence offences. So this chart here shows that about 40% of people had only one crime was recorded and it was coercive control, but 60% had at least one other type of offence recorded by police at the time. The nature of those are pretty typical domestic violence offences: intimidation, stalking, domestic assault, malicious damage. So it's not happening in isolation. That's probably what we also expected, that really those standard domestic violence offences would still be doing the heavy lifting in terms of the criminal justice response, but and that's bearing out in the figures here. We're also keeping an eye on a whole bunch of other associated factors. So we have a raft of reference groups that have contributed to ideas about what to monitor, and some of those I'm going to present now. Alcohol involvement, not particularly common. New South Wales Police are able to record whether an incident is mental health related or disability related. We're actually not seeing many of those flags being triggered for coercive control. That could definitely be a recording issue, but it's not coming up in the volumes that people were concerned about at the outset. And also typical with domestic violence, generally we are seeing a heavy domination of offences from the regions. So in New South Wales, about 60% of the population lives in Sydney, but in terms of coercive control and domestic violence, generally the numbers are flipped, and we're seeing many more incidents come from the regions, really reflecting where domestic violence is most prevalent. But we also do publish at quite a low level where the distribution of offences are occurring across New South Wales. So people can really see there's definitely places that have had no coercive control incidents and some that have had more than that. So that's also a learning for us in terms of the education that's been rolled out. A couple of other things. So victim characteristics, obviously very a lot of interest there, particularly interest around the problem of misidentification of offenders and victims. So we are seeing the majority of victims female, and you can see the age there and the relationship type. We require that the relationship be an intimate partner relationship in New South Wales. A lot of people have also raised questions about how coercive control will impact LGBTQI communities. This is the gender relationship between victims and offenders here. We are not finding particularly many same-sex relationships, but the male same-sex relationships are more common than female same-sex relationships. And this issue of misidentification, we've got a small number of incidents there, no charges, and I'll get to charges, but no charges have been laid against a woman for coercive control. But we do have those, I guess, a more typical heterosexual relationships being the dominant relationship type that we're recording in terms of coercive control. And the other thing that has been on the radar is how this will impact Aboriginal, how coercive control will impact Aboriginal people. We're actually finding fewer Aboriginal victims for coercive control than we find for other domestic assault offences. So we normally around 20% or slightly more coercive domestic violence victims in New South Wales are Aboriginal, and we're seeing only 10% for coercive control. But nonetheless, there is interest in the Aboriginality of the offender and the victim. We've recently added this to our reporting, and I think that's useful for Aboriginal people to consider both the impact of this offence on Aboriginal victims, but also how it might contribute to Aboriginal people flowing into the criminal justice system, and particularly custody. We have, I think, probably the biggest concern in New South Wales to date has been the low charge rate. So I said we had 244 incidents. We've only had 5 charges in the first 3 quarters, so 9 months. That's about a 2% charge rate. It's very low. And you can see what's happened there. 2 of those are still waiting for their court, a day in court. One of the person pleaded guilty and received a community supervision order, and 2 of them have been withdrawn by the prosecution. So we're actually still waiting for that kind of test case to go through the court, where we understand what the court's required to prove coercive control. So that one proven matter, that person, individual, did plead. So we still don't have the court's view from the court on how they will deal with coercive control. At least one of those pending matters is going to the district court. So we are seeing some matters that are serious enough that they will go to the higher courts, not just be arbitrated in the local court. But we can see also that many incidents of coercive control, because they're occurring with other offences, they are resulting in charges, just not a coercive control charge. So 41% of that total have a charge that's not coercive control, and those tend to be the same types of domestic charges that are typical: assault, breaching AVOs, and also intimidation and stalking. Okay, I just have a couple more, possibly the last slide actually. Characteristics of the 5 people who have been charged. No Aboriginal offenders have been charged in New South Wales to date. And the other concern that has been raised with us is how coercive control will interact with apprehended violence orders in New South Wales, so domestic violence protection orders. So we have been able to observe that about a quarter of those coercive control incidents occurred in an environment where an AVO was already in existence. And in an additional 53% of incidents, an AVO was initiated post the coercive control metric. So AVO is very common in this coercive control environment that New South Wales Police are recording. So we are recording these, putting out a statistical report each quarter at the moment. If people are interested in that, they should jump on our website. I'm sure Teresa will put a link, and you can sign up for an alert to see those reports when they come out. Sorry for the data dump. I'll hand back to you, Teresa, and happy to answer any questions.
I wouldn't apologise. I think that's exactly what people are here for. While you were talking, Sinead arrived. So I'd like to say welcome, Sinead, and welcome to the conversation. I have a couple of reflections, and then I might offer Hayley the opportunity to maybe make some comment on some of that data as well. So thinking back to the sort of initial slides where you were saying that there's often other charges that are happening at the same time, that coercive control is often not happening as an isolated charge. That certainly aligns with the UK experience as well. I was talking to someone just the other day, and they were saying many of the coercive control charges even there are often accompanied by a physical assault charge of some sort. And then I was thinking about the second slide that you had about the types of coercive control that were being reported, and I wondered whether the ones that were higher up the list were the ones that were easier to actually evidence. So a stalking or a tracking might be easier to, show evidence of messaging. Financial abuse might be easier to, there might be some records of that might be easier to produce. Do you have any reflections or thoughts on some of those?
I hadn't actually thought about that. I mean, I think what is becoming apparent is that the police have been quite good at probing for incidents, and even incidents that may not be on front of mind for the victim. The police are using that expanded understanding of domestic violence and really trying to talk to victims about whether there are other behaviours that they're experiencing that could fall into under this heading. So I don't have any particular view about what's happening on the ground, Teresa, other than I think we are seeing that evidence that the police are taking that broader view as a result of this legislation.
Hayley, would you like to offer any reflections on
Yeah.
what Jackie was speaking to?
I would. So I regularly deal with people who go through the system and effectively have to negotiate charges. It's been I've practiced in that area for nearly 15 years. So when police choose which charges to file against an individual, the prosecuting concept behind that is that the most appropriate charge should be filed. And usually police will tend to lean into a charge that's easy to prove, or where the elements of the charge are easily established, because it's effectively, you know, it's shooting a duck in a barrel. It's an easy prosecution. You can get the outcome in that matter successfully. So, for example, if you have nasty text messages, the charge that is easy for that kind of conduct is use a carriage service to stalk, molest, harass, or intimidate. That carries a 2-year maximum penalty in the local court. The police do not have to prove whether the person intended it. They just have to prove that the text messages were sent and that the content of those text messages, for the reasonable person who reads them, would be harassing or intimidating. So there's this preferencing for the charge that's fitting and easy. And where that gets tricky is when you get a situation where the police have a bet each way. Mm-hmm. So they'll put a charge that they would be hopeful that they could prove. That's a more challenging charge to prove. It's got more difficult ingredients. And then they'll put what's known as a backup charge as an alternative charge below that. And then there's the space of lawyers, which is the in-between, where we try and either negotiate that we take the lower charge and have the higher charge removed, or we offer a third option, which can resolve the whole matter altogether. So because the way they've written coercive control in New South Wales, and also I understand in Queensland, is that it's a charge of intention. Intention charges are the hardest type of charge to prove. You've got strict liability charges, which means, for example, if you were to imagine you have a car accident, all that has to be proved is that there's been a car accident. There's no get out of it. It's the car accident happened. So that's sort of like the baseline level of proof. The next level up from that is a type of proof called recklessness, which is where the person physically committed the act, didn't really think about it. Their state of mind doesn't need to be proved. They didn't really think what they were doing. It happened. Middle of the road level of proof. Top level of proof is I did it, and when I did it, my actions were driven by my intention to create that result. High level of proof required. So that's the type of level of proof that's required for murder. You have to intend to kill the person. And that means that when police are charging, there are incentives to charge for, bigger penalties, but there's a disincentive in the sense that, well, if we can get the low-hanging fruit, why wouldn't we prefer that option? And then on top of that, you've got the defence lawyers whose duty it is to get their client the best result that they can, that's legal and available within the structure of the legal system, to get the charge that's got the least penalty attached to it. So the outcome of that doesn't surprise me, that we've had fewer levels of numbers of prosecutions, and that other charges are preferred or buddying up along the coercive control charge. What I'm really interested to see, and I've read the newspaper reports about the singular matter that resulted in a conviction in coercive control. And I've read all the cases I could get my hands on in the UK where appeals happened. And in every single one of these examples, and in the Tasmanian cases as well, the narrative of the offending is horrific. It's so bad that only the charge of coercive control had to be laid. And I have to say, in my review of all the data I've read about coercive control, I think that standard is too high for what actually happens for victim survivors. And I actually think that there are public policy reasons that if there are 5 text messages that are harassing and that convey information where the only basis for sending it is to do an offence that harasses the other person and coerces them or controls them, why not charge coercive control? And that's an important policy issue, because then you really start to change the way that people experience the justice system, the way offenders experience it, and the general deterrence for the community. You know, if you send 20 horrific text messages, you should expect a charge like this to be placed upon you. And it really changes it for victim survivors. So that's where you start to move into the space of prosecuting guidelines that bind the decision-making of police and bind the decision-making of the Director of Public Prosecutions about why they would elect to charge on coercive control and not what's known as a strict particulars offence. Or the government could drop it to a recklessness standard. Now, we have a similar offence in New South Wales called strangulation, non-fatal strangulation. It has 3 levels. It's got you strangled the person, that carries 3 years. You strangled them to unconsciousness, but you didn't mean to, 5 years. You strangled them to unconsciousness and you did mean to, 10 years. And I really wish that the way they wrote coercive control was a graduated system as well, so that you could have the basic, the moderate, and the extreme standards for these types of prosecutions.
Wow. Thank you, Hayley. I think, Sinead, this is a really good time to bring you into the conversation. Thank you for joining us. So we were talking just now about the data that BOCSAR has been collecting, and we heard from Jackie that there were quite a few incidents, in a couple of hundred, but there were relatively few charges. We're hearing that most of the examples are from heterosexual couples where the woman is the victim, and we heard a little bit more about what those cases look like. So, welcome. You work with the police, but you're not actually a police officer. Could you just kick us off by telling us a little bit about your role and what it entails?
Sure. And apologies, everyone, for coming in after the webinar had started. So I'm Sinead Berry, and I work with the Domestic and Family Violence Command as the Policy and Project Manager for Coercive Control. So our command was set up maybe 18 months to 2 years before the implementation of the legislation. And within our command, we now have a small coercive control team that is our only focus, looking at what's happening statewide on the ground with our general duties, with our investigations, with our prosecutions, and also connecting with our reference groups and community sector. So one of the many things we do, we analyse 30% of all coercive control incidents each week. So looking at the cops' narratives, looking at the body-worn footage, looking at domestic violence evidence in chief, to really get that good insight into how we are tracking and travelling from the ground up, and where the gaps are, where the strengths are. Based on the gaps, we do, bespoke interventions and obviously more statewide interventions as well. So one of our large-scale projects that was finally released last week is statewide lived experience mandatory police training in coercive control that will be delivered face-to-face over the next 12 months. The process started last week. We spent 12 months working on it, pulling it together, and now it's finally gone, in addition to all of the other coercive control training we've had. So I suppose there's an ongoing continuous focus in that space from the coercive control team within this command.
Fantastic. So from your perspective, what you've heard from what Jackie was sharing, what Hayley was sharing about her perspective, does that align with what you're seeing in the data from the police?
Yeah, look, elements of it do. So I think there's complexities with the legislation. I think if you talk to any investigator or prosecutor, they will note some complexities with it that doesn't make it easy for them. When we look at Queensland in comparison to New South Wales, it's a 14-year offence in Queensland. It's a 7-year offence, assuming it gets to the district court in New South Wales. So that in and of itself creates complexity, as well as the length of investigation that is potentially required to prove that pattern of behaviour and intent, as Hayley said. So there's layers of challenge there. I was just on another a Teams meeting with an interjurisdictional group through DCJ, and DCJ noted that New South Wales with coercive control, and where we're currently at with statistics, we're actually ahead of the modelling and what was predicted. Jackie, I know the BOCSAR data came out a week or two ago, but since then there have been a number of other charges that were laid. So we're currently at 8 charges for coercive control. In addition to the one that was prosecuted, he pled guilty, so it wasn't contested, and 2 that were withdrawn very early on in the piece. And we have around about 92 that are under active investigation. So it's moving forward. When you look to, we have regular contact with UK jurisdictions. Only a week ago, I was talking to Police Scotland again, and looking at how their data was travelling in the early phases of coercive control. Very similar, slow and steady. That process of, it's a real culture shift for such a large organisation as New South Wales Police is, to move from policing the incident to the pattern of behaviour in a relationship. And keeping in mind, those general duties are often our youngest, most inexperienced constables turning up to someone's house. Perhaps it's a 20-year-old, it's a couple in their 50s, married 20 plus years. There's lots of challenges incumbent in that interaction. And we're trying to change the process and flow of how they do their work in the DV space. So we're seeing some positive things. There is always room for growth.
Excellent. Jackie, here's a question that you haven't prepared for. Sinead mentioned just now that there is some training that's being rolled out across police that they're very excited about. Do you have the capacity at BOCSAR to track the impact of that training, like the way that it's changing behaviours?
We haven't done that, Teresa. We weren't asked to do that. We haven't done that. So it is a question that I think we all wonder about, but no. What we are doing though actually is another research study that talking to victims and complainants who have engaged with the criminal justice system since the coercive control legislation came in, and that will be all manner of domestic violence survivors, and inquiring of them how their experience is in this kind of post-coercive control environment. So that will pick up, presumably, it ought to pick up the police training that's been undertaken, and it should pick up domestic coercive control victims and also other victims. So that's what we're doing to try to cover that off. But so it's a little bit indirect, but hopefully give us some insights there about how people are actually experiencing the criminal justice system since this reform came in.
Excellent. I look forward to seeing the outcomes of that. Hayley, do you have anything you can share about what you're actually seeing about the function of the law now it's in place, what people are actually experiencing on the ground?
Yeah, so I've attended over 30 sessions like this, seminars, conferences, and the thing that's really impressed me is how interested the community is in getting educated about it. I've attended multicultural events, Aboriginal and First Nations events. It is inspiring to see how leaders in those communities are open to the discussions about this issue that we've all been studying and we've all been working through. That's been a sort of a underlying sense of hope for me, that it's almost still shocks me that the government made these laws. I'm still impressed that it happened, because you only have to go back. It's 50 years this year since the family court actually came into existence in New South Wales. And before that, people had to get divorced essentially through a form of petition. They'd hire actors to say that they'd been having an affair. And in 50 years, to have travelled so far, in a sense, in our laws, is something I'm very hopeful. You know, you only have to look at the situation in other nations, and it is very sad. It's sad for victim survivors. It's sad for predominantly women. statistically. So I'm very happy that the state of New South Wales and the state of Queensland have led the charge. I really want to see it nationally. I think the fact that it's so, it seems, I don't mean to single out any particular state, Victoria, but it needs to, we need to see the conversation being made on a national level in the same way that family law is on a national level, the same way that apprehended domestic violence orders were united nationally. So that's something that I'm seeing on the ground. In terms of offenders, I have seen, as I always had seen, I have seen misidentified persons. And in my personal experience as a practitioner, they are women as well. So I currently have one on my books. I've had them on my books in the past. They need appropriate skilled representation to assist them because they're in the most complex problem legally that anyone could really ever be in. So that's what I'm seeing on the ground.
It's very interesting to hear about the uptake in the community. It was a very different perspective that Sandra had from the UK. She said that there wasn't a lot of community involvement in the conversation or the debate as it rolled out. So yeah, it's a very different response and action in Australia. Yes, we could talk about the Victorian experience. They're not here to talk about the very intentional reasons that they have for keeping coercive control in a non-criminal space. Again, this is a question that no one's prepared for, but I was having a conversation around this whole topic with a lawyer yesterday who was very frustrated by the fact that the law had been put in place, especially the fact that it had been moved out of the civil space into the criminal space. And he was talking about the standard of evidence, the standard of proof that needed to be met. So obviously when we're looking at it in the civil space, we're talking about balance of probabilities. And when we're looking in the criminal space, we're talking about beyond a reasonable doubt. So does anyone have any reflections on the pros or cons of shifting that required level into the criminal space? Perhaps I could start with you, Sinead, if you have anything to say.
Sure, I do not have a legal background, so I'll use that as a precursor to what I'm about to say. But I think for coercive control, given the devastating impact it has on victim survivors, and the impact it has in DV homicide statistics, and we know the vast majority of DV homicides have had substantial coercive control indicators now, retrospectively. I think it required that degree of legislation to actually allow us to educate community and all sectors of community. I think if it stayed in the civil space, it would continue to be the poor behaviour of, if we keep it in the gender space, a husband towards his wife that was, not very pleasant, but nothing more than that. This has really, I think, challenged community and challenged the sector to reframe and rethink domestic and family violence, and then consider how that is impacting victim survivors and the breadth of behaviours that are there. Only in the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at stalking through the use of drones. It is limitless and it is endless. How sort of the non-physical behaviours, and then we step into that technology facilitated abuse area, the overlap between one and the other, and I'm not sure that as a society we'd have this laser focus in this area if it wasn't identified as criminal and had to go through the justice system.
If I can just say, I do agree with what you say, Sinead, because it's the civil standard, although it's the lower standard, it's the balance of probabilities. To get them, and coercive control essentially is a form of a tort. It's an act of wrong that creates an injury. So essentially, it is a civil tort. To get a civil case to court without a prosecution service is the space of privileged people. And the same standard is applied in the family law space. So if a finding of coercive control is made in a family law environment by a family court, it only needs to be made to the balance of probabilities. But In terms of the outcomes for victim survivors of family of coercive control, if they don't have the capacity or are eligible for legal aid to run a matter to civil law or to run a matter in the family jurisdiction, they're essentially locked out from remedy. Mm-hmm. So again, it comes back to those public policy concepts behind how we deal with rights and wrongs in the community, and placing something in a criminal context allows for the state to intervene in the behaviour of individuals in the private space that's harmful. And it's no different just because it happened behind closed doors. It's no different from harmful behaviour that happens on the street. We take someone who parks illegally to court. Why wouldn't we take someone who abuses their partner to court?
Thanks, Hayley. I'm sure that there is lots of different opinions on the way we should go, but I think we'll move on from that now. Jackie, I wanted to come back to you. We aren't as blessed in Queensland to have an organisation like BOCSAR that regularly, produces the sorts of evidence and the sorts of data that you do. But I do know that many of the practitioners that are in our audience today are wanting to be across the changes and the experiences of people going through the courts. If people are wanting to track the use of this law and they don't have the resources that you have, what advice do you have for them about how they might keep across, or what if they were to collect any data at all, what should they be collecting?
We've had so many data requests, Teresa. The demand for data on this particular offence is unprecedented. It's just, it would be a great shame, I know from our experience, if we had not been able to keep up with meet the demand, there would have been many dissatisfied people. Mm-hmm. So the data is there. It's in the police system. I think the police could share it, which is not ideal, but better than nothing. To the credit of the people who set up the coercive control regime, was actually the former government here in New South Wales. They were very minded to consider what the data needs were, and they had very formal channels where people could ask questions and that's how we have this quite unbelievably extensive suite of data that we have. So I think it's a good idea to have formal discussions about what data is needed to monitor the reform. And I think the government probably need to commit to some kind of reporting, whether it be with the Queensland statistician, or whether it's with New South Wales, with Queensland Police, or wherever it comes from. I just don't think that people will be satisfied unless there's some concrete data availability. It's it could never have gotten away with it here. And I think in the absence of the formal data, there's just speculation too. All that speculation about misidentification, for instance. So that's been raised from day dot, really, and we're not necessarily seeing it, but we'll keep looking for it. But it's reassuring that it's not there. So I think you move from that idle musings to the concrete with the data.
It's so true. I mean, working at a research organisation, I couldn't agree with you more. We have had some questions come in. People are very interested in everything that you've had to say. There are some that you might expect, so people are interested in the topic of misidentification, and I think we have addressed that, and we will continue to see how that comes through in the data that you've seen. And we've got another one about we don't have the same sort of system in Queensland. There were a couple of people who were interested in why 2 charges were withdrawn, and is there anything that we can speak to about the situation?
I don't know anything about those in particular, but I think Hayley can probably speculate from a more informed position than I am. I just think probably the evidence wasn't there. But what do you think, Hayley?
Well, it doesn't. The BOCSAR data doesn't tell us whether they were withdrawn in lieu of another charge being preferred. So that ordinarily happens as part of a prosecution. So we will have a case where a person's charged with, assault, reckless, grievous bodily harm, and that charge is withdrawn and the case finalises on an assault occasioning actual bodily harm. So it could be a result where the charge was just withdrawn and another charge was the outcome completely. Mm-hmm. Or it could be a case where, in a number of matters across a year, I would have maybe 2 or 3 clients where the final outcome is charges withdrawn. And the background behind those types of cases are usually ones where the person who's made the complaint, the complainant, has retracted the complaint legitimately, and the prosecution has reviewed the retraction and it complies with their prosecution guidelines to take the case away. So it's usually often in a situation where a complainant makes a positive statement to say that they'd actually lied, and there's usually evidence that goes along with it, often supplied by the defence. So that's the kind of situation why a charge is often withdrawn.
I can add a little bit there, Teresa, because I'm across all the charges. So the 2 that were withdrawn, it was very, very early on in the piece. One of them, the offender was under 18, and it's an adult. The offender needs to be 18 here. And
Same
the
in
other
Queensland,
one,
if anyone's wondering.
And there were 9 other charges for the other one. And having read the detail supporting those offences, there just was insufficient evidence to support coercive control. It seemed to be very early and reactionary. Let's pop it in there as well. So they were withdrawn for reasonable reason.
Okay. Maybe Sinead, I'll put this other question to you as well, and Hayley, you might have something to say about this too. I don't think that you've got a concrete answer to this question, but you can maybe give a hypothetical answer to this one. The question is, what does the evidence look like that has to be provided? So can you maybe talk to the sorts of things that might constitute evidence of a coercive control charge?
That's a really big question, Teresa.
People are very concerned here in Queensland about
several briefs. Yeah. The briefs of evidence that I've read to date that have come through and resulted in charges, they've been fairly extensive. So they have looked at patterns of behaviour over months. Some have used tendency and coincidence information to support the charge or the process of language.
What is tendency and what was the other one?
Coincidence. So Hayley, you can probably do that much more succinctly than I can.
Similar fact you do that. Similar. So it's called. I always like normal people language, not lawyer language. Normal people language. It's similar fact evidence. Hey, 6 months ago you went down the shop and bought 10 ice blocks. Here you are buying 10 ice blocks again. Similar fact. You're the kind of person that buys 10 ice blocks all the time. That's the tendency and coincidence. Yeah.
Thank you. So the tendency and coincidence evidence that's coming through obviously predates the legislation. So it's pre-July 1. Because we know if that pattern of behaviour existed pre-July 1, it is going to continue post-July 1. But the evidence that holds is post-July 1. So in the vast majority, we are seeing multiple behaviours being displayed, not just the repetition of one type of behaviour. So it sounds like I came in at the end of some of the most frequent behaviours, coercive control behaviours being displayed. That is really very representative, as it should be, of our COPS data. So stalking, intimidating, shaming, degrading, financial control. We're seeing multiple behaviours coming across, and we're seeing that as a continuous pattern across the breadth of relationships. Some other interesting things that we are also observing is in relationships that traditionally, where let's say it was an intimate partner relationship that had been going for however long, months, years, period of time, and there were continuous sexual assaults in that relationship. We are seeing coercive control in there too, which is not surprising, but they're not necessarily in the first instance being reported as domestic and family violence by the victim. It's going down that sort of sexual assault trail, and then it's coming back around to the coercive control space. So yeah, that's and there's very clear patterns of behaviour that fit in there too. One of the other behaviours that we've perhaps seen fairly commonly has been system control. So when we think about the isolation of a victim survivor, we are seeing in some cases victim survivors also isolated from their own families of origin, because the offender's perspective is being believed by many. So whether that's family of origin, whether that's you know, if they go to church, whether it's church groups or whatever other engagements and interests they have, we're seeing the victims really being isolated to the point of reporting and reaching out for support is exceptionally difficult, because then you overlay that with gaslighting, second guessing themselves, and the impact of that sort of psychological and emotional control. Very challenging.
We have some more questions coming in now that really are at the front of mind for a lot of the people in our audience. So our audience are practitioners. They do a lot of work to support clients to connect with lawyers. They do work to support people to tell their story. They obviously do a lot of case noting of their own. There's also, we haven't unpacked it today, but there's also been changes to the Evidence Act in Queensland, which has made the use of preliminary complaint evidence more of a thing, which people may or may not know. So people are asking questions like, they'd love some tips from Hayley around whether she thinks case notes from DV services might be used to evidence intent and how to best navigate this, and a broader question around how the legislation impacts NGOs. And I think that what sits underneath a lot of these questions is concerns that people have about practitioners in support services being asked to provide evidence in court and what that means for their own safety, for risks to them, their privacy, and how they might navigate the supporting their clients in the best way possible without, you know, risking or harming themselves in that action. So Hayley, would you like to speak to
I
any
can.
of that?
I was actually just examined on this topic 2 weeks ago. In New South Wales, we have a part of the Crimes Procedure Act here. There's probably a similar format in Queensland, which essentially puts a bar on confidential relationship evidence between a victim and their counsellor. It relates to sexual assault here. It's not in relation to coercive control. But what it essentially says is that that's a protected confidence, that relationship between the victim and their counsellor, anything that goes between those two individuals is not to be used in court. And then, as lawyers always have, there's the exception that, you know, well, that depends. So you can argue in certain situations that the information is so probative that an exception should be made, and the evidence should be allowed to go into court. This talk is about coercive control, so it's not necessary that legislation doesn't cover coercive control prosecutions. So theoretically, and this is something that hasn't yet happened because the legislation is so new in New South Wales, theoretically, the defence could seek through a subpoena calling of evidence of the victim of coercive control's notes with the counsellor. It already happens in family law. Those subpoenas already happen. And it is extremely, it can be very painful for the person who's the victim survivor, and it can be extremely difficult for the therapist because it can impair the therapy relationship of trust. In the space where it applies in sexual assault, a whole group of warnings happen. The judge has to give warnings to the counsellor. They can make objections. So we haven't legislated around this yet. And if I was to put a bet on, it's going to happen because the problem's going to perpetuate itself. It's just like in sexual assault. We've tweaked the sexual assault legislation over the years because they've had feedback from people who've gone through the court process where they used to have to sit in the dock and explain to the prosecutor or the cross-examiner how they were sexually assaulted. And over time, that's moved into being put in a remote room, having their evidence pre-recorded and now having their notes protected. And I would expect that similar kinds of policies will happen here. DV victims in New South Wales are already able to do their evidence remotely. So it would naturally follow that evidence that's highly personally compromising ordinarily over time tends to be protected in forms and ways. But for practitioners now who work in counselling capacity, yes, the notes can be subpoenaed at this time. It's probably a practice guideline that would exist somewhere where when the person enters into the relationship, they would have to have a disclosure that anything that's provided, anything that's stated can be subject to subpoena. And most professionals have that undertaking, I would expect, already as part of their ethics and guidelines of practice.
Thanks, Hayley. I do know that there is in Queensland, and I don't know the full functioning of how this works, and you'd obviously have to speak to someone who does know, but there is the opportunity to, I think, request to be considered a special witness, which can help protect some of the privacy stuff that people are concerned about. We have a question here about what types of relationships are covered. And so we talked about that at the start. So in New South Wales, the relationships covered in the legislation are intimate partner relationships, people over 18 or perpetrators over 18. In Queensland, it's intimate partners, family relationships, and informal care, as in not paid care relationships. And then we have a question here that I think that you're quite primed to answer as well, Hayley. So, because I know that you've been doing some work with a colleague of yours across the border. If someone lives in Queensland, but the perpetrator is from a state where coercive control legislation is not in place or is different, as in the case of New South Wales, can they be charged with coercive control? For example, what if that person is a former partner?
Yeah. So this is the state of origin question. And it's the paper I'm trying to work on. The New South Wales law is structured so that as long as you have part of the offence in New South Wales and part of the offence in Queensland, you can be prosecuted in New South Wales. The Queensland offence, I understand, has a similar provision, but I'm still getting my head around the Queensland legislation as not being a Queensland practitioner. And where that gets tricky and where the blind space in the legislation is we don't have what's called border provisions. And so if you've got a piece of legislation that carries 14 on one side of the line and 7 on the other, who prosecutes? How do they do it? How does the police choose which state to prosecute in? And generally, please do correct me if I'm wrong, generally it defaults, Sinead, to the state where it's reported. So where that gets tricky is when people's addresses are transient. I'm a frustrated legislator, would-be legislator. We need border provisions because this is what's going to come up, and this is what cases that we'll be reading in 2 or 3 years from now we'll be dealing with. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. We are just about to run out of time. I feel like we have only just scratched the surface. We could be here all afternoon diving into this issue. I would encourage the panelists today, if you're happy for people on the call to connect with you, contact you to drop your email addresses in the chat. Otherwise, people can contact me and I can pass questions on. I'd like to thank you all for participating in this conversation today. It's very timely and it's very valuable. The rates of registration for this webinar were extremely high, which shows just how high the interest is in this topic. As you were saying, Jackie, people want to know the data, they want to know what's going on. The questions from the audience have been insightful and spot on. I think that everyone's super engaged and it's made for a really interesting webinar. People in Queensland, if you are interested in this topic, if you are interested in unpacking it further, I strongly encourage you to check out our upcoming roundtable event. It's happening in 2 weeks. It's called Responding Together, and it's an opportunity for Queensland practitioners to come together in the same room to unpack some of these really thorny issues in greater detail and identifies ways that we can move forward together and support each other and to support the clients that we work for. You can see the tile for that on the screen at the moment, and there should be a link in the chat as well. I strongly encourage you to check that out, and if you have any questions about that, you can reach out to me. We will be posting a recording of this conversation on the WorkUP website soon, and we will let anyone who's registered know via email when that happens. And we will be sending you a link to complete a survey, and we really encourage you to do this, to let us know, was this useful, what could have been better, what could have been different. It really helps us to improve and make sure that we do deliver the sorts of information that is useful to you. On that note, thank you everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.